The procession whipped rain into the air, the pavement glistening like a lady in a ball gown. Thunder rolled afar. But among the turmoil of the storm, there was something far spookier, something that sent shivers down the spine of everyone who noticed. Story comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. A husky. He was not rushing for shelter. He was not foraging for food. He wasn't seeking warmth. He was waiting, just beyond the hospital's glass doors, unmoving, drenched, his frost-blue eyes fixed on something or somebody inside. Initially, he attracted no notice from anyone. Stray dogs were a fixture in the city, and most people figured he would eventually be on his way. But the hours passed, and the husky stayed, and rumors started to spread among the hospital staff. Why wasn't he leaving? Was he lost? Was he abandoned? Or was he waiting for somebody? Emily, a young nurse who worked nights, was the first person to really see him. She had just finished rounding on patients when she spotted the silhouette outside the doors. The dog's unflinching stillness gave her pause. For some reason, her heart contracted. She picked up a small towel from the counter and went outside. The cold immediately pierced her scrubs, but she tuned it out. "Hey there, buddy," she said, crouching. The husky didn't move. He kept his eyes on the doors of the hospital. But when she extended a hand, he flinched. Not out of fear, out of desperation. Emily now saw it. It was no mere stray. His coat was heavy but unkempt. His body was skinny but not starving. His eyes sharp, intelligent, searching. But this dog wasn't just wandering. He was here for a reason. Then, a noise broke into the air. A stretcher was wheeled through the hospital lobby, the distant beeping of monitors and urgent voices reverberating off the walls. Emily glimpsed the passing gurney, just a man, unconscious and pudding pale, careening through the corridor. And that's when it happened. The husky moved. It was the first time in hours that his whole body went tense. His ears perked up, his tail stiffened, and then he howled. Not a bark, not a whimper. A mournful, grating, heart-wrenching wail. A howl that made the hair on Emily's neck stand up. A howl that caused every pair of ears within the bones of the hospital to turn toward it. It was a cry of recognition, a cry of desperation, a cry of love. Emily's breath hitched in her throat. Was it just a coincidence? Did this dog have some kind of connection to that man? All the hairs on her arms stuck up. Something inside her knew. This husky was not just any old stray. He was here for that patient. And whatever that was, it was about to surprise us all. Emily had frozen, her heartbeat thundering in her ears. The atmosphere surrounding her felt dense, as she was stuck in a moment that shouldn't be real. The husky's bright blue eyes were fixed on the hospital doors, his entire body taut, ears standing straight up. He wasn't merely looking, he was pleading. This dog knew something. Emily gulped. As a nurse, she was trained to respond, her instincts screaming at her to concentrate on her work, to walk back through the doors and let the doctors see the patients. But something deeper, something primal, kept her here. She was not the only one who observed. Behind her, a security guard, 2 nurses, and a doctor had congregated near the entrance. "Is that dog crying?" The voice of the security guard wavered slightly, his brows knitted. Which, yes, the husky's eyes caromed. Not from the rain, but from something else. From pain, from fear, from loss. The dog whined and stepped forward, but the automatic glass doors wouldn't open for him. The guard shook his head. "He needs to go. We don't want to have a vagrancy here." Emily's heart clenched. "Wait!" The guard stopped in his tracks, one eyebrow angling upward. Emily turned back to the husky. She saw it, the unflinching emotion in his eyes. This wasn't just any stray. He wasn't lost. He was here for someone. But who? And why? She knelt down again, this time extending her hand cautiously. "Hey, boy, who are you waiting for?" she whispered. And then, the husky did something else that gave her chills. He raised a paw and placed it gently on the glass. Not in confusion, not in curiosity, but in recognition. Like he knew just who was inside. Emily gasped, "Oh my God!" But before she could react, there was a loud beep in the corridors of the hospital. A code blew. Someone inside was flatlining. The hospital staff sprang into action. Nurses sprinted. Doctors rushed for emergency supplies. Frantic voices rang out around them. And the husky? He howled again. This time, it was not merely sad. It was urgent, desperate. It was as if he knew. And Emily's stomach dropped, because she knew it too, deep down. The patient coding inside, the man who was now fighting for his life. It was him, the one that the husky had been waiting for. She glanced back at the husky, her hands quaking. "Who are you?" she whispered, but she already knew the answer. This wasn't just a dog. This was someone's last hope. And if they didn't find out why he was here, it might be too late. The emergency alarm still blared through the hospital's cavernous halls, an ominous reminder that someone in there was barely holding on to a thread of life. The panicked hurrying of nurses and doctors faded into the background, but outside, standing in the frigid rain, the husky refused to budge. He didn't need to witness the scene within. He already knew. Emily had this sensation of a beating heart in her chest, turned back and looked at the dog. Every reasonable part of her was certain this could not be happening. How does a dog detect something like this? And the way he had reacted to that patient. It was as if he knew. She gulped, looking at the security guard who had lost his patience. "This dog isn't going to be here," he said. "I'll call animal control." "No." The word came out before Emily could tamp it down, sharper than she meant. The guard raised an eyebrow, yet very unimpressed. "Listen, I know you think what's happening here is something else, but it's just a stray. He has been here all day sitting. We can't have him in the way of the door." Emily hesitated. She wanted to fight back, to assert that this was more than coincidence. But how could she? That a dog just happened to show up at the hospital, fixated on a patient who was now on death's doorstep. That his howl was not merely sound, but a desperate plea? It sounded insane. But her instincts shouted that there was something else. Suddenly, the husky stepped toward the glass, leaned its paw against it again, and fixed its gaze on the frenzied activity within the hospital. His eyes no longer plead, they demand, they were determined. A shiver ran down Emily's spine. The automatic doors slid open a crack as a nurse dashed out for air, and for a moment, the husky coiled as if he might bolt inside. The guard swore under his breath and stepped forward, blocking the entrance. "That's it. I'm getting rid of him." He bent down, took hold of the husky's collar. Big mistake. The instant the guard's hand touched him, the dog produced a low, warning growl, not aggressive but protective. His muscles wound, his posture resolute. Emily's heart tightened in her throat. She didn't know why, but something in her gut told her that this dog fought for something bigger than himself. The guard let go at once, muttering something about stubborn strays. "Fine. You want to deal with him? He's your problem now." Emily barely heard him. She was focused on the husky, which now faced her straight on. For the first time, she saw something in his eyes that turned her stomach. Recognition. Not just any recognition. He was looking at her like he had to have her, like she was his last hope. She breathed out slowly, shaking her head. "Who are you, boy?" The husky made a slight whimper and turned back toward the hospital doors. The weight of his stare twisted something in her chest. Who was he waiting for? And why was there a sinking feeling inside her that if she didn't find out soon, it would be too late? The rain had stopped, but the air outside the hospital was still thick with humidity, clinging to Emily's skin like a harbinger. The husky hadn't moved. His body was stiff, his eyes still fixed on the entrance to the hospital, as if through sheer will alone, he could already pry the doors open and bring him to whoever he was waiting for. Emily clenched her fists. She had encountered stray dogs in the past, hungry, lost, frantically looking for food or a place to live. But this one, he didn't want food. He didn't want warmth. He wanted someone. She looked back at the security guard who continued to shake his head in irritation. "Listen, I don't care what you believe is taking place here. This is a hospital, not a dog shelter," he said. "Either you take him somewhere, or I'm going to call animal control." Emily's stomach twisted. The husky groaned low and melancholic, and then swiveled his head back toward her. Then he stepped forward. Not toward the door, toward her. Emily's breath caught. She looked at the dog and it looked back, sending chills racing up and down her spine. There was something in his eyes, something almost human. A plea, a mitigation, a silent cry for help. Her heart pounded. She didn't know exactly why, but something deep inside her said she couldn't simply walk away. Not now, not after this. She got down on her knees, using the quietest voice she could muster. "Okay, boy, I hear you. I know you're here to meet someone. But I need to know who." The husky blinked, his ears flicking forward. And then, in the strangest, most purposeful movement she had ever seen from an animal, he raised his paw and rested it against her knee. Emily gasped. He was choosing her. A lump formed in her throat. This was more than instinct, more than coincidence. This dog was here for a reason, and now he was looking at her to figure it out. Inside, the hospital remained in turmoil. The code blue had sent doctors rushing, and Emily had the sinking feeling in her gut that whoever was fighting for their life inside was why this husky wouldn't budge. She needed answers. She got up and walked toward the glass doors, pausing only briefly before entering. The husky let out a short burst of a whimper, his body tensing. "Wait here," she whispered, unsure if he would even comprehend. But somehow he felt she had. Inside, the ER was a blur of movement. Doctors barked orders. The nurses rushed from station to station, air heavy with antiseptic, tension filling the atmosphere. Emily headed for the nurses' station, scanning the chaotic scene for a familiar face. Then she saw him, Dr. Carter, one of the hospital's most experienced doctors, and the man who had been presiding over the emergency case that had arrived earlier, the unconscious man who had sent the husky into a rabid frenzy. Emily's heart raced as she ran toward him. "Dr. Carter!" she called. He hardly looked up from the chart in his hands. "Not now, Emily. We're engaged in an important case." "I know," she said quickly, breathing fast. "But I need to know. The man who just came in, the one who flatlined. Do you know his name?" Dr. Carter finally turned his gaze toward her, his features taut. His ID was missing. No wallet, no phone, no records. "We don't even know who he is." Emily's stomach dropped. No ID, no name, no records, no way to know who he was, except reality hit her like a freight train, and she gasped, except for the Husky, the dog outside, the one who had been waiting, the one who had screeched in despair the second the man was wheeled in, the one who was still there, still waiting, still knowing. Emily heard her pulse loud in her ears. She whirled on her heel and ran back toward the entrance. She needed to return to that dog, because somehow, some way, he had been the key to this whole mystery. Emily's feet hardly touched the ground as she sped down the hospital hallway. Her pulse thudded in her ears, keeping pace with her frenzied thoughts. The man had no ID, no name, which would give the hospital no way of knowing who he was, except the Husky, the stray that had paced, watched, and yowled the moment the man was wheeled inside. Emily stepped through the double doors toward the outside, gasping in the cool night air. The Husky was still there, still waiting, still knowing. The instant she stepped out, his piercing blue eyes trained on her, as if he had been waiting for her. Emily crouched, her hands gripping his dense pelt and feeling the rainwater that still clung to his coat. "Listen to me," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't know who he is, but you do, don't you?" The Husky didn't blink. He didn't flinch. Instead, he did something that ran a chill down her spine. He nodded. Emily's heart skipped a beat. It was not an illusion of the light. It wasn't a coincidence. This dog understood her. He knew who that man was, all right. With this realization pressing down on her like a tidal wave. This wasn't just any stray. He wasn't lost. He had come here on purpose. The hospital doors opened behind her, and the security guard stepped through the doorway again. Irritation etched across his face. "Listen, I don't know what is going on, but this dog has got to go. I already contacted animal control." Emily turned her head sharply toward him. "You what?" "They'll be here in 20 minutes, the guard complained. "He's a stray. He can't remain here, and you can't hold on to him." A surge of panic blossomed in Emily's chest. She looked back to the Husky, who was now standing perfectly still, his ears twitching as if he understood exactly what was going on. "They're going to take you," she whispered, her throat closing up. The Husky gave a low whimper, his head turning again toward the hospital doors. He also knew his time was running out. Emily gritted her teeth. No way. She would not let them take him. Not when she was this close to uncovering the truth. She inhaled deeply, and she made a choice that didn't belong to her. "I'll take responsibility for him," she said, rising to confront the security guard. "He's with me now." The guard scoffed. "Oh, yeah? And where exactly do you intend to take him?" Emily paused just a moment before speaking. "Inside." The guard laughed. "That's not happening. You cannot take a dog into a hospital." Emily narrowed her eyes. "He's not just a dog." The guard crossed his arms. "Then what is he?" Emily looked at the Husky, his ice blue eyes catching the glare of the hospital lights. "He knows who that man inside really is, and he's the only one." The words floated in the air between them, pregnant with meaning. The guard hesitated, and for the first time his bravado broke. You actually believe that?" Emily didn't hesitate when answering. "Yes." The Husky exhaled slow and steady, as if to say he agreed. The guard shifted his weight and looked back and forth between them and the dog. "Even if that were the case, nothing changes. Animal control is coming." Emily's mind raced. She had minutes, maybe seconds, to find a way to end this before the Husky was carted away. And then an idea struck her. It was risky. It was insane. But it was all the opportunity she had. She pivoted and strode back toward the hospital doors. If no one inside had known the identity of the unconscious man, maybe then it was time they allowed the Husky to identify him himself, because somehow, some way, this dog knew the truth, and she was soon going to show it. Emily began to shake as she clung to the Husky's damp fur. It felt like a heavy fog weighing down the weight of what she was going to do. Bringing an animal into a hospital broke every rule in the book. The sterile environment, the risks, the liability, this was unprecedented. But there was a quality in the Husky's eyes, something undeniable. He wasn't just any dog. He was a witness, a man who had part of the puzzle no one else did. And if she allowed animal control to take him now, the truth, the link between this dog and the unconscious man indoors, might never be uncovered. Emily looked back at the security guard, who was still eyeing her back with suspicion. "Did you say animal control is 20 minutes out?" 15 now, he corrected, glancing at his watch. She took a deep breath. "Then, I've got 15 minutes to prove this dog right there belongs to that man inside." The guard scoffed. "Oh, yeah? And how do you figure you're going to do that?" Emily gazed down into the Husky, whose blue eyes held her own with laser-like intensity. "I'm going to leave it to him to find him." The guard made a short laugh. "You're crazy." Emily didn't argue, maybe she was. But she also felt it deep down in her gut that this was the only way. She squared her shoulders, faced the hospital doors, and found her answer. She was going to get this dog into the house. The automatic doors opened, and Emily went inside. For a moment, the Husky paused, his paws suspended just over the threshold. The hospital's fluorescent lights glinted off his wet fur, and for a moment, it seemed that he too understood the gravity of what they were about to do. Then he stepped forward. One paw over the threshold, then another. And just like that, the Husky was in the hospital. Emily held her breath. No alarms, no instant chaos, no one had noticed yet. She was brisk, leading the Husky down the long hall, positioning herself between him and a nurse's station filled with staff. If anyone even saw them now, they'd be stopped right then and there. Her heart raced as they neared the ICU. This was it. If this Husky really knew the man inside, if it recognized him, there could be no denying the truth. Emily barely passed the nurse's desk when a voice sliced through the air. "Emily!" Her stomach twisted. She looked toward the hallway to see Dr. Carter standing there, arms crossed and face inscrutable. "What are you doing?" His voice was steady, but it had a distinctive edge. Emily opened her mouth, but before she could get a word out, the Husky bolted. Slipping between her legs, he raced down the hallway with dread-inducing speed, straight toward the ICU, directly to the lapsed man. Emily's breath hitched. Dr. Carter's eyes widened. "What the—" Before anyone had an opportunity to react, the Husky arrived at the patient's room. And then he jumped onto the bed. Gasps filled the air. A nurse screamed, a security officer charged toward... But then something happened that stopped everyone in their tracks. The Husky didn't bark. He didn't growl. He laid down, carefully, gently, next to the man's still body, and the next, he put his head to his chest. Emily felt her breath catch, like a deep, agonizing silence in the room. No one moved. No one spoke. It felt like time had stopped on that moment. And then, the monitors beeped. Not a flat line, not an emergency alert. A heartbeat. A change. Dr. Carter drew a sharp breath. "That's impossible." This brought tears to Emily's eyes. and because she knew in that moment it was self-evident. There was a husky that had found his person, and against all odds, that man was still hanging in there. A stunned silence filled the hospital room. The husky lay curled against the unconscious man, his head resting gently on his chest. The rhythmic beeping of the monitors echoed in the background, confirming what no one had expected. A heartbeat, a change, a flicker of life where there had been none. Emily felt her knees weaken as she took a slow, shaky step forward. Around her, doctors and nurses stood frozen as if their minds were struggling to process what they were seeing. Dr. Carter was the first to move. He rushed toward the bed, eyes darting between the monitors and the patient. "This doesn't make any sense," he muttered under his breath. He was barely stable. There was no sign of improvement. But now, he trailed off, his eyes locking onto the husky. The dog wasn't moving, barely even breathing. It was as if he understood that his presence alone was keeping the man tethered to this world. Emily swallowed the lump forming in her throat. She turned to Dr. Carter, her voice barely above a whisper. "He knows him." Dr. Carter gave her a sharp look. "What?" Emily stepped closer to the bed. "This husky has been outside the hospital all day waiting. He howled when this man was brought in like he knew him, like he recognized him. And now, the moment he's beside him, his vitals improve?" She shook her head, her voice growing stronger. "This isn't just some coincidence. This dog is connected to him." A tense silence filled the air. The security guard who had followed them in scoffed. "You're telling me a dog somehow knew this man was in here and helped stabilize him? That's ridiculous." Dr. Carter didn't respond right away. He was staring at the patient, his fingers pressing lightly against his wrist, checking for a pulse. His face remained unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of hesitation. "Ridiculous or not," he murmured, the patient's vitals were crashing when he was alone. Now they're improving. Emily exhaled slowly, watching as the husky pressed closer against the man's chest. There was a softness in the way he moved, as if he knew exactly how fragile the situation was. Then, a sound, so faint, so weak, that for a moment she thought she had imagined it. A groan, a whisper of life. The man had made a sound. Dr. Carter's head snapped up, his entire body tensing. "Did you hear that?" Emily barely managed to nod. One of the nurses rushed to the man's bedside, her voice trembling. His fingers moved. Emily's breath hitched. Dr. Carter leaned in, his voice urgent. "Sir, can you hear me?" Nothing. A long, painful pause. And then, a second groan, low, rough, but unmistakably real. The husky lifted his head slightly, ears twitching. Dr. Carter turned to the nurse. "Get me another round of vitals. I want an update on his oxygen levels and brain activity." Emily could hardly breathe. This man had been unresponsive when he was brought in. There had been no signs of movement, no sounds, no indication that he was anywhere but on the edge of death. Until now. Until the husky found him. Emily knelt beside the dog, running a gentle hand through his thick fur. "You did this," she whispered. "Didn't you?" The husky didn't respond, but his tail gave the faintest wag. Like he understood. Like he had been waiting for this moment all along. Dr. Carter exhaled, rubbing a hand down his face. "This is unreal," he muttered. "I've seen some strange recoveries before, but nothing like this." Emily hesitated before speaking again. "We still don't know who he is, do we?" Dr. Carter shook his head. "No ID, no records, and he hasn't regained consciousness yet." Emily glanced down at the husky. "Then maybe it's time we find out who he is." And if this dog is the key— She looked up, determination burning in her eyes. Then we start with him. The husky let out a slow, deep breath, his gaze steady. It was almost as if he already knew what they were about to uncover, and it would change everything. The hospital room was still. The unconscious man's fingers had twitched. A weak groan had escaped his lips. And yet, he had not awakened. The husky was pressed against him, its head rising and falling in sync with the man's shallow breaths. It was an image that challenged the laws of logic and science and medical reality. Emily stood next to the bed, her hands balled into fists at her sides. Years she worked at this hospital, and never, not once, had she seen anything like this. Dr. Carter was silent, looking at the monitors, his face inscrutable. Finally, he turned to Emily. If this dog is in any way related to him, we need to figure out how. Emily nodded. I want to try something. Dr. Carter gave her a skeptical look, but didn't stop her as she took a tentative step toward the bed. She swallowed hard. Then she said what she had been wanting to say since the moment she had seen the husky waiting outside. If you can hear me, you tell me your name. Silence. Not even a twitch. Emily let out her breath, disappointment curling in her gut. Maybe it had been too soon. Perhaps whatever flicker of life had prompted the man to groan had merely been that, an illusion of hope. But then, a sound, so faint, so fragile she almost thought she had imagined it. A whisper, one breathless syllable. Lou. Emily's heart stopped. She whipped around to Dr. Carter, who was already moving, eyes swollen with shock. Did he just— Emily didn't wait for any confirmation. She faced the husky, her heart pounding. The dog's ears were up, his eyes trained on the man's face. His body shook, not out of fear, but something deeper. Recognition. Emily's chest tightened. She rotated to the patient, crouched slightly, her voice barely above a whisper. Luke? A sharp inhale, a movement beneath his closed eyelids. Then, a second whisper, this one clearer. Luca. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She didn't have to look to the husky to know what she already knew. The dog had only just received a name, and Luca was his. Dr. Carter inhaled sharply. He's responding. Emily barely heard him. Her mind was racing, but the husky had been waiting for somebody. And now he had found him. The security guard earlier froze in the door, having wiped his earlier skepticism completely. You've got to be kidding me, he muttered. Emily took the man's hand, her fingers touching his frigid skin. She didn't know who he was. She didn't know from where he had come. But she was absolutely certain about one thing. This husky, Luca, had never given up on him. And somehow, against all odds, he was back. But the question remained. Why had they been separated in the first place? The name hovered, dense with significance. Luca. It was the sole word the unconscious man had been able to say. A name. A connection. And the husky, his body had stiffened up. His ears perked, his breath hitching in his chest. His blue eyes were wide with an expression that was shock and recognition. The heaviness of the moment rested heavily upon Emily like an anchor. This wasn't a coincidence. The husky had a name, and it had been issued by the man who had just moments before been knocking on death's door. Dr. Carter was already in the fray, checking the man's pulse, his pupils, his vitals. His brain activity is improving, he muttered, half to himself. This is unreal. Emily barely heard him. Her eyes were set on Luca. The dog was trembling, not in terror, not in agony, but in something deeper, something buried, something remembered. Emily inhaled slowly and carefully and whispered, Luca?" The husky whimpered. It was a sound Emily had never heard a dog make, relief and desperation, and something that almost sounded like grief. Finally, Dr. Carter faced Emily, his voice low and serious. "We need to find out. Who is this man? Fast." Emily nodded, her mind racing ahead. The hospital had already searched his pockets. No ID, no phone, no way to contact anyone. But there had to be something, some clue. Then the doors to the hospital lobby burst open, almost as if the universe had been expecting her to ask the question. 2 police officers strode in, their faces stiff with grim determination. One of them, a tall man with dark eyes, looked around the room until his eyes set on Dr. Carter. "We need to talk to you about a patient who came in earlier today, unidentified." Emily's heart skipped a beat. Dr. Carter narrowed his eyes. "You mean the John Doe from the accident?" The second officer nodded. "That's right." He paused before adding, "We believe we know who he is." A stunned silence followed. Emily sensed Luca moving beside her, his paws tilt pressing into the floor. Every muscle of his body was taut, as if he too understood that whatever happened next would upend everything. Dr. Carter folded his arms. "Go on." The first officer exhaled, looking at his partner before he continued. "His name is Daniel Holt." Emily's stomach dropped. That name, it felt important, reminded her of something she'd heard before, something that mattered. The officer went on, his voice stern. "He was reported missing 2 weeks ago." Emily's breath hitched. "Missing?" The officer nodded. "Declared dead, not just missing." The words landed hard in the room like a hammer. Emily's heart began to race. She glanced sharply to her left at the unconscious man, Daniel Holt. Declared dead? So what the hell was he doing here? Dr. Carter was already rifling through his chart. "That's impossible. He was discovered just outside of town, unconscious. If he was dead, why didn't anyone come looking for him?" The officer's jaw tightened. "That's what we're working to discover." Emily felt Luca move next to her. The eyes caught on him. His body was all but trembling. His breathing was uneven, and his ears were pinned back, because he knew the truth. And whatever had happened to Daniel Holt, it had been no accident. Emily felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Declared dead? She turned to look at the unconscious man, Daniel Holt. The man Luca had been waiting for. The man who'd been lying on that hospital bed, unresponsive, with no one looking for him. Because everyone thought he was already gone. But that wasn't even the most terrifying part. The way the officers spoke, the hesitation in their voices, the weight behind their words. This wasn't just about a missing person. Something else was going on here, and Luca knew it. Emily glanced down at him, her breath catching in her throat. He was no longer trembling. His body had gone rigid. His blue eyes weren't just focused on Daniel anymore, they were focused on the officers. Emily had seen this look before, not in a dog, but in a person. Suspicion. Dr. Carter was the first to break the silence. "You're saying he was declared dead? What exactly happened?" The taller officer, the one who had spoken first, shifted uncomfortably. 2 weeks ago, Daniel Holt's vehicle was found abandoned near the river. His personal belongings, wallet, ID, even a jacket, were inside. There was no sign of a struggle, no signs of foul play. Emily frowned. Then why was he presumed dead? The second officer cleared his throat. "Because of what we found next." A heavy pause. Emily's stomach twisted. "A body," the officer finally said. "Unidentifiable, but wearing Daniel Holt's clothes. The assumption was that it was him." A cold chill ran down Emily's spine. Dr. Carter narrowed his eyes. You assumed a man was dead because of a body that looked like him? The officer shook his head. It wasn't that simple. There was another factor. Emily swallowed hard. What? The officer exhaled. A witness. A sharp silence filled the room. Emily's pulse hammered. Luca let out a low, almost imperceptible growl. Someone had seen what happened. Someone had told the police that Daniel Holt was dead. But Daniel wasn't dead. He was here, which meant whoever had reported his death had lied. Emily's hands clenched into fists. Dr. Carter's expression darkened. Who was the witness? The officer hesitated. Then finally, we don't know. Emily's breath caught. What do you mean, you don't know? She demanded. The officer sighed. The report was anonymous, a phone call. No name, no identification. Just someone claiming to have seen Daniel Holt's body being pulled into the river. Emily felt Luca shift beside her. The dog's muscles were tense, his entire posture screaming alert. Because this wasn't just an accident. This was a cover-up. And whoever had tried to get rid of Daniel Holt hadn't expected him to survive. Dr. Carter exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. All right. So if Daniel Holt was never actually confirmed dead, why is this coming up now? The first officer's face tightened. Because we think whoever tried to kill him just found out he's still alive. Emily's stomach dropped. Luca let out another low, rumbling growl. And for the first time since she had stepped into this hospital, Emily felt something new, fear. Emily's heart beat so loudly she swore the officers could hear it. Daniel Holt had been declared dead because someone had wanted him dead. And now, whoever had tried to kill him knew that he was still alive. That realization pressed down on her like a storm cloud, dark, heavy. Dr. Carter's voice broke the silence. When someone wants you dead, how do you still live? The officers shared a glance. We don't know, one of them confessed. All we know is 2 weeks ago, he vanished. And then suddenly, he shows up, unconscious, just outside of town, half frozen and barely holding on to life. Emily swallowed hard. That was too much coincidence. She glanced at Luca, who hadn't left Daniel's bedside. The Husky's gaze was fixed on the officers, his ears perking up after almost every word. Because Luca knew. He had the missing piece somewhere buried in his memory. But how could they unlock it? The security guard who had been standing in the doorway laughed quietly and let out a low whistle. So, let me get this straight. You know, like some dude tried to kill him, made sure he disappeared. Then he gets a phone call saying, this guy is dead, only to find out now that he's really alive. The officers nodded grimly. The guard scoffed. Well, I'm not a detective, but I can imagine whoever made that call is probably in a panic right about now. Emily's stomach turned. He was right. Whoever had attempted to wipe out Daniel Holt had not succeeded. And now that person, whoever the hell they were, would be desperate to finish what they started. And Dr. Carter rubbed a hand over his face, and then exhaled sharply. So, what happens now? The jaw of the taller officer clenched. We have to find out who wanted him dead. And fast. Because if they know he's alive. The room fell into a heavy silence. Then, the lights flickered. Emily's breath caught. Fluorescent bulbs above them flickered, casting melancholy shadows across the hospital room. For a fraction of a second, there was complete silence. Then, the power cut out. A gasp went through the hospital. The heart monitor attached to Daniel emitted a long, low beep, and then fell silent. Darkness swallowed the room. Emily felt Luca's hard muscles pushed against her leg. 1 second later, the backup generators kicked in. The lights flickered back on, but the tension in the room didn't lift. Something was wrong. Emily turned to the officers. Was that a coincidence? Or tell me it was a coincidence. Neither of them spoke. Dr. Carter looked at the monitors. He's stable, he muttered, relief flooding his face. But his hands still shook slightly, because they all felt it. That moment of total, all-consuming silence, like something or someone had just stormed the hospital. Luca emitted a low, guttural growl, a warning. Emily's stomach twisted. Then down the hallway, footsteps, slow, measured, coming straight toward them. Emily's breath hitched. Someone was here, and whoever they weren't here to help. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, echoing down the darkened hall of the hospital. Each step was deliberate, calculated, too careful. The tension in the room hung like a blanket, suffocating, choking the air from Emily's throat. Luca growled deep and low, rumbling from the depths of his chest like a warning. His body stiffened, ears pinned back to his head, eyes trained on the darkened hallway outside the hospital door. Something wasn't right. The two police officers shared glances, unsure. One of them, the taller of the two, instinctively went for his holster. The other officer's jaw clenched as he pivoted toward the door, placing himself protectively between Daniel's hospital bed and the noise, while the approaching sound rolled forward. Emily could hear her own pulse pounding in her ears. The hospital was operating on backup power, meaning only essential systems were functioning. The elevators wouldn't work. Door handles for non-emergency entrance and exit would be locked. And yet, someone had just walked in. Dr. Carter's voice was soft. We're on a secure floor. Who the hell else would be here this late? No one answered, since they all knew the truth. Whoever it was wasn't supposed to be there. A dark silhouette loomed just outside the glass window of the ICU door. Tall, broad shoulders, so a long coat which would swish a little with every step. The figure hesitated just outside, standing under the faint glow of the emergency exit sign. Then they went for the door handle. Emily's breath hitched. The officer closest to the door reacted immediately, his voice firm. Step back. Identify yourself. Silence. For a long, agonizing moment, the figure remained motionless. And then, slowly, deliberately, the handle turned. Emily instinctively stepped back and bumped into Daniel's hospital bed. Her pulse quickened as she made a cold and terrible realization. The door shouldn't open, not during a power failure, not without a security key. And yet, the lock clicked. The door swung open. The room went dead silent. Luca lunged, a blur of white and gray fur as he lunged, mouth open, a savage snarl slicing through the air. The figure in the shadows stepped back sharply, just in time. Luca ground to a halt at the doorframe, still growling, every strand of fur standing on end, vibrating raw, unfiltered fury. The figure spoke for the first time, a low, measured voice. Good dog. Emily's blood ran cold. The taller officer advanced, gun drawn. Hands where I can see them. Now. The figure paused for a split second. Then they stepped back down the hallway and vanished. Just like that. Emily blinked. What? Where did they? The officer pushed forward, pulling the door open wider. Stepping into the corridor, his partner following closely behind. But the hallway was empty. No footsteps, no retreating figure, not a sign that anyone had ever been there. Just a weird, heavy silence. Dr. Carter took a slow, shaky breath. Please tell me I'm not the only one who saw that. Emily's heart was racing so painfully. They were right there, she said in a whisper. Luca remained in the doorway, his chest heaving. all the muscles in his body coiled and ready to spring. He hadn't imagined it. None of them had. Someone had come for Daniel, and they would be back. The hallway was heavy with silence. Emily froze in the doorway, gazing into the emptied passageway where the shadowy figure had stood moments ago. The atmosphere remained charged, heavy with irrepressible discomfort. Luca hadn't moved. He kept his body stiff, his stance unyielding, ears alert and attentive. The Husky knew what they all felt deep down, that whoever that had been, they were not gone. Not really. The taller police officer, still holding his weapon, looked down the hallway a second time. This doesn't make sense. A quivering breath escaped his partner. They were right here. We all saw them. Emily swallowed hard. But where the fuck did they go? The words had hardly escaped her mouth when a sound rang out through the hallway. A soft click, faint, distant. Then, a slow creak. The emergency exit door. The officers rushed toward the sound, instantly returning to the scene. The great metal door at the far end of the hall was swinging closed. Dr. Carter exhaled sharply. That's a restricted exit. With the power failure, it should have been locked down. Emily's stomach churned. They shouldn't have been allowed to get in here in the first place. And yet, they had. The officers arrived at the door, threw it open, guns drawn. Nothing. The emergency stairwell was deserted, not one sign of the intruder. One of the officers muttered an expletive. "They're toying with us." Emily's skin prickled. "What do you mean?" The officer turned to look at her, jaw clenched. That whoever that was, they wanted us to see them. A chill raced through Emily's body. The implication was terrifying. This was no run-of-the-mill break-in, some random stranger sneaking by hospital security. This was deliberate. Someone had gotten inside a secured ICU during a total blackout with no sign of forced entry, and they had departed as easily as they had arrived. The other officer sighed, frustrated. "We need to get Holt to a safe place." Emily's breath caught. Daniel. She wheeled back toward the hospital room, her heart thudding. The fear, the confusion, the tension, it had clouded them all. But there was a man still lying unconscious in that bed. And he was the reason any of this was happening. She bolted back inside with Luca close behind her. Daniel Holt was still there. His breath continued to be steady, his vitals unchanged. But then, Emily spotted something different, something that had not been there before. Her pulse skyrocketed. A piece of paper, one neatly folded paper lying next to Daniel's pillow. Her fingers shook as she extended for it. Dr. Carter's voice was sharp. "Emily, wait." Too late. She unfolded the note, and under the dim light of the hospital, she read the words that made her blood run cold. He wasn't going to make it. The room spun. Emily sensed Luca go rigid next to her. The officers drew closer, their eyes widening as they read the note over her shoulder. The meaning was clear. This wasn't over. Whoever had attempted to kill Daniel Holt, they were returning to complete the task. Emily's hands shook around the paper, her thoughts skimming away. This room had had someone in it. Someone had gotten past security, past locked doors, past all of them. And they had left a warning. Luca emitted a low, deep growl by her side, his fur bristling. He felt it too. The risk, the threat still in the atmosphere. The police officers sprang into action. The taller of the two snatched his radio. "We need backup at St. Joseph's ICU, now." The other officer held Dr. Carter's gaze. Is he well enough to be moved? Dr. Carter didn't hesitate. Barely. But if someone's coming after him, we don't have that luxury. Emily's heart raced as she turned to Daniel. He was still unconscious, still oblivious to everything happening around him. But she couldn't shake the sense that he was nearby. Like any minute, he could wake up. Like he was fighting. The officers rushed into action, readying Luca for transport, but he wouldn't leave Daniel's side. His body tensed, his eyes fixed on the door of the hospital, as though expecting. Emily knew what he was feeling. They weren't safe yet. Then, the power cut out again. Darkness swallowed the room. Before Emily could so much as react, Luca jumped into action. A low, guttural bark split the silence, and someone moved. A shadow crossed just outside the door. Emily's blood ran cold. They weren't alone. One of the officers yelled, flashlight piercing the darkness, "Show yourself!" No response. Then, a rush of movement. The emergency exit slammed open. A shadow flitted down the corridor. Running, Luca took off. Emily didn't have a second to think and was off running after him. The Husky was fast, faster than she had ever known him to move. He tore down the corridor with barely his paws touching the ground, a shadowy form fleeing into the stairwell at the back, its footsteps echoing down the hall. Emily and the other officers followed right behind. Luca lunged, snarling, but the figure was already through the stairwell door, vanishing into the stairwell. When they reached the landing, they were gone. Emily halted suddenly, her chest rising and falling. The officers cursed quietly as they searched the stairwell with flashlights. Nothing. Whoever it was, they were gone. Silence filled the stairwell except for Luca's measured, calm breathing. Emily sank down beside him, petting his fur. "You were so close," she murmured. Luca didn't move, but when she met his gaze, she saw something she had never seen before. Relief. A job completed. Emily turned back to the hospital room where Daniel lay unconscious. The danger had passed. For now, but the truth was clear. Whoever had attempted to kill Daniel Holt, they had failed. And now they had run. Because Luca had found him. Because Daniel had survived. And because no matter what had happened before, they had lost. Emily sighed, slow and steady, then glanced at Luca. "You saved him," she said softly. Luca finally eased up, his tail wagging just a touch, because he knew. He had accomplished what he set out to do, and he wouldn't leave Daniel's side again. Emily stood and looked down the hallway one last time. The shadow had disappeared, but the story wasn't over. It was just beginning. The cold, lonely Husky who wouldn't leave had finally found home, and he wasn't going anywhere.